Hey, how is it going? I'm Chris from 99scloud.com. This video is a part of a series that brings you from zero to hero building an AWS HTTP REST API with a React Web Frontend. In the previous part, we have set up a basic React application. This tutorial is a continuation of the previous part, so if you haven't seen it yet, you can find the full playlist in the comments section below this video. In this part, we will be going to connect to our AWS HTTP REST API to fetch all our nodes. In order to do that, we will also have to add some configuration to the code of our HTTP REST API. So stay tuned. Hey, and welcome back to part 2 of our React Nodes application. Let's take a look at the agenda. First, we will be adding code to our Home.jsx file. Then we will be creating a configuration file into which we can add the URL of our AWS HTTP REST API so that we don't need to hard code it in our code files. Then we will be fetching data from the HTTP REST API. Then we will be configuring CORS in the HTTP REST API. And then we will complete fetching and displaying the nodes. So let's get right started. At the moment, all these files look a little bit empty, so let's start filling them with code. So the first file we will be looking at is the Home.jsx. And in the Home.jsx, the only thing what I want to do here is I want to create a link that goes to nodes. So when the application is loaded, we will get onto this home page, but on this home page we then want to be able to navigate to the nodes page. So in order to do that, we will add a link, and we will add this link through the React router. So the React router has a link component, but additionally to this, also the Material UI has a link component so that the link is styled the right way. So let's see how we can actually implement that. So let's first add the link from the React router. So we can type import link as router link from React router DOM. And then we will also import link from @MUI/material. Obviously, we cannot use link 2 times as imports. That's why we define the React router link as router link and the Material UI link as link. So let's add this link down here in our application. Here we will say home sweet home. There's nothing better than home. And then here we can type link component equals router link. So what we are doing here is that the Material link component supports adding the functionality of other components, such as the router link component. So that's why we add this router link component into here. So we inherit basically the functionality of this router link. Variant equals body 1, 2 equals /nodes, and then we can close this. And what kind of error do I have now? Link component equals router link. What does it say? Component used for root nodes. What I need to do additionally, I need to wrap this into another div. So I will need to copy these 2 lines here into this div. So React needs like a container in which the HTML resides. And this is why we need to put all this code into additional divs. Okay, so we can save this. And if we now go back onto the home page, so we just go back onto the main page, then we have this home sweet home, but we don't have this link yet. So let's see what's going on here. It should basically be, h1. Let's take h1 tags. Let's check this again. I don't know why we don't have this link component displayed yet. It's of course because I need to specify a name here. So it's /link. And then here I will just say nodes. Okay. And when we go back, then we can see, we have this nodes here. So here we just have this h1 tag, home sweet home, and then we have this nodes link. And if I click on this link, as you can see, it goes to the URL /nodes to our list nodes page. Okay, we are now nearly ready to create the code for our list nodes function. But before we do that, we want to get the URL of the AWS REST backend and add it into a configuration file in this React application. So we will just go onto the console. Then we can go into the other project. See the nodes, how did I call it? Nodes HTTP API. So that's basically the serverless framework code that we have written before. And here, if you still have it deployed, then you can just type SLS info, I believe it is. And that will output the URLs that we have added again. So if you wouldn't have deployed it, then you can just type SLS deploy. This will then also output the URLs once it's deployed, but we can just use SLS info if we deployed it already to get this output. So we can just copy this base URL and go back into VS Code, and in here under src we can create a new file, and this will be called config.data.json, config.data.json. Okay, and into here we will put the JSON configuration data that our application will need. So here we can just type basic JSON. So we will call this AWS REST endpoint, double point, and this will be the URL. So we don't want to have this in our code files directly. as the URL might change if you redeploy it. So if you would delete the REST API and then recreate it through the serverless framework, then this URL here will be different, and you would have to add this new URL to this config data.json file. So the good thing is we just have to configure this in one location and not in all. So once we have done that, we can go into the components folder again and into nodes and here into list nodes. Okay, so how do we now import this config data.json file? Well, we can do it through a normal import. So we can just type import config data from config data.json. Okay. And then what we will need to do next is we will need to set up a state variable. And we will do that the following way: const nodes set nodes equals react.useState with an empty array. So the good thing about the state variable is that once defined, it will be available throughout the life cycle of the current list nodes page. So as long as we are on this page, this variable will stay defined. The next step is to create a fetch nodes function that connects to our AWS REST API, gets the data, puts it into this nodes state variable so that we can display it in our HTML page. For this, we will create an asynchronous function. So I can just type async function fetch nodes. It has to be asynchronous because the library that we will use to connect to the AWS REST API is asynchronous in nature, and that's why also the function has to be asynchronous. So the library that we will use is called Axios. So let's import Axios so that we can work with it. We can do that by typing import Axios from Axios. And that should be it. So let's first define the URL to our nodes get endpoint, which is const nodes get endpoint equals config data.aws REST endpoint plus /nodes. Okay, now that we have this endpoint URL defined, we can make the connection with Axios. So we will use the try and catch statement in case there is any error. Try, catch, error. Okay. If there is an error, then we will just log it to the console, console.error. So this will just display the error message on the console. And then here we can type const response equals await axios.get and then the nodes get endpoint. So what this does is it connects to the nodes get endpoint, which is the URL that we defined up here. And it will wait until the response is returned. And then once the response is returned, we can get the data from the response. So we can say set nodes response.data. Save. So what this will do here is as soon as we get the response, then the data of this response is added into this nodes variable up here. Okay, so we have defined this function, but now we will need to execute this function. And when do we want to execute the function? We want to execute it when the page is loading. And for this, we can use a special React hook called useEffect. So we can say react.useEffect. And here we will have a function. And in this function, we will call fetch nodes. Okay. Now, the issue with this is when we define it this way, then the useEffect function will be executed on each re-render of the page, and there might be several re-renders. So we don't want to have it executed more than once, because that would mean that it makes more than one connection to the AWS REST API, which will be a high payload, because it will take a few milliseconds until it actually connected to the REST API and got all the nodes back. In order to have this React.useEffect only executed once when the page loads, we will have to add an empty array here. If we add this empty array here, then it will be executed only once when the page loads. So in order to see what actually happens, we will need to load the developer tools. And here we have this console. And in this console, we can see the output. So basically, when we go back to React, so we can see the console output, which we output through this console command in this console window here. And as you can see here, we have an error which says access to XML HTTP requests from origin localhost 3000 has been blocked by CORS policy. No access control allow origin header is present on the requested resource. So let's have a look at what this error is exactly. So CORS is standing for cross-origin resource sharing and can limit the servers that can access the REST API by allowing only certain IPs or host names. And the default, of course, is blocking out everything. So where do we actually need to change this? We will need to change this in our REST API on the AWS cloud. So for this, we will need to go back into our HTTP REST API and configure CORS there. Okay, so let's go into the console. And here we are still in our Nodes HTTP API. So we are in the right project. And here we will need to add some configuration options. So we will just open VS Code. So we can just type code dot in here, which will then load up a new VS Code window. I will just move this over here and make it bigger. And here we can go into the serverless.yaml file. And what we will need to do here is configure CORS. So in order to configure CORS, we can somewhere under the provider option, we can just say HTTP API CORS true. And what this will do is it will enable CORS for all host names and IP addresses by default. We could add additional configuration options which limit the access, but as we are using it in development mode, we don't want to do that. We just want that everything is open. so that our application can reach the REST API. So basically we can close this window again, then we can go back into our console and we can deploy the application again. So we say SLS deploy. Okay, so this has been deployed. So let's go back into the HTML page. And if we reload, then you can see that this previous error has gone. We still have an error while trying to use the following icon from manifest. So let me check on this quickly and then get back to you. As you can see here, this is somehow loaded in this index.html file. So it's here. So we can just remove this. So it's in public and index.html. And we can just remove this. And when we go back into the website and we reload, then we still have it. So let me check this and get back to you. Okay, I think I found the error. So this logo.192 is also in this manifest.json file. And I don't think we actually need this manifest.json file. So I'll just go into index.html, remove this from here as well, as we don't need it. Then we also don't need all these comments here. Let's clean this file up a little bit. And then we can also get rid of these comments down here so that it looks a little bit cleaner. I think this should now be okay. The favicon, we leave this in here for the moment, but we will delete also this manifest.json file. I don't think we will have any use for it. And if we go back onto the page, refresh, okay, then we can see that no further error is here. And we can continue with our code. So let's go back into Visual Studio Code. So what we can do is we can just go down here and we can add a console.log notes to see if we get any output. So let's go back into the browser. And as you can see here, we have now an output and we can see that we have 5 entries. So basically 5 nodes. Now you might have an empty output if you didn't add any entries. So what you can do is you can just go into the AWS management console. So let's do that quickly. I'll just go into awsamazon.com. Sign into console. Now we are in the console, then we can go up here and type DynamoDB. Then we can go on to tables. Here you should have your nodes table. And if you click in here, we can click onto explore table items. And down here, as you can see, I have these entries defined already. But you could click onto create item, then you could just define an item in here. Okay, let's go back to our application. Now we have gotten back these nodes. So now what we need to do is we need to display these nodes on our HTML page. So we will go back to Visual Studio Code. And then in here, just remove this list nodes. Here we will just create another div. And then down here, we want to output all the nodes so that we can see if it actually is working. So as it is asynchronous, the the node's state might not be defined yet when the page is re-rendering, because it might re-render 2 or 3 times, and maybe only the second or the third time the node's state variable will be defined. So when it's undefined and we just put it in like this, nodes, then it will fail because it's undefined. So we will actually need to check first if this variable is defined already. Here we can just type nodes dot lengths greater than 0. Then we will do something, or we will do something else. Diff. And then let's define a diff down here as well. Diff/diff. So here we say if the nodes variable is actually defined and the length is greater than 0, then we will want to display the nodes. So here we will display nodes. But if the length is 0, then it means no nodes have been found. So we can just type no nodes have been found. Just to let you know, when you actually define an empty array down here, you will get this funny warning that the React use effect has a missing dependency nodes. You don't actually need to care about that. It will work anyhow, but somehow there is always this warning displayed. It first drove me round the bend, but I learned to live with it. So just ignore it when you see it. So let's go back to the page. And as you can see, we get now the output display nodes, which means that nodes were actually found. So when we refresh, you can see very quickly that it says no nodes found, but then it changes immediately to display nodes because nodes have been found. Okay. So let's go back into the code, and instead of just saying display nodes, we will actually display the nodes. Here we can add more code, and we can say nodes.map in a function. Then we will pass the node, and here we will return HTML. We will use the rounds brackets, and then we will just write diff/diff, and in this diff we will write nodes.node. So we will just iterate through the whole nodes array. So for each of these array entries, we will then display the node. That's basically all we are doing. And if we go back to the page, then we get an error. So what is the error? Warning: each child in a list should have a unique key prop. Okay. That means we will need to specify a key to this diff down here. So we will say key equals, and we will say nodes.id. So React is expecting always that a key is defined with a unique ID for each of the entries that it iterates over. So we will just use the ID because the ID is a unique key. And if we go back and refresh, then we will still have an error, and this error says encountered 2 children with the same key. So let's have a look at this second error first. So the second error here says objects are not valid as React child found object with keys S. And this tells us something, right? Because what we need to do in here when we want to display the node, we will need to say node.nodes.s, because it's this string kind of thingy again from AWS, and nodes.id.s. So now when we go back, then we can see that all errors are gone and we get this output. So here we have all our nodes displayed. And with this we have now come very far already. So we have actually connected to our REST API, we got all the nodes, and we can actually display the nodes in our React application, which is neat. This brings us to the end of this tutorial. If it was valuable, I'd appreciate if you could give it a like and consider subscribing if you want to see more content like this. If you want to watch the full series on how to set up an AWS HTTP REST API with React Frontend, or check out my website, there are links in the comment section below. Have a good one and see you in the next video.